Hi there, and welcome to the last video in our series exploring government intervention. So far you should have watched two different videos. One was on the impacts of indirect taxes and subsidies. The second one was on maximum and minimum prices. This final one will cover the things in green at the bottom of the screen. So regulations, tradable pollution permits, state provision, and information provision. So we're going to be thinking about how these four different types of intervention can be used to tackle the market failures of public goods, information gaps, and externalities. So let's think first of all then about regulation. Okay, now let's think first of all about what regulation actually is. Now, all regulation is where the government, they impose rules in markets. So these rules are legally binding. So there'll be criminal convictions dished out to people that break these rules in markets. Now, these rules will govern the expectations of both consumers and producers. So it's outlining exactly the legal responsibilities of consumers and producers within these different markets. Now, the idea would be that regulations can correct lots and lots of different market failures. Now, let's say, for example, we wanted to use regulation to reduce the consumption of demerit goods. So remember, demerit goods are generally overconsumed in a free market economy. So we're going to be thinking about what can we do to reduce the consumption of these products. Well, ultimately, we can introduce bans. We could literally make these products illegal to be sold and bought within markets. So when you think about drugs in the UK, they are more or less outright banned. What we can also do, we can introduce age limits. So, for example, the sale of alcohol or tobacco products cannot be sold to anyone under the age of 18. Anyone caught selling it to people under the age will be prosecuted using the law. And we can also have restrictions on where these products can be bought and sold. So limits on who can sell alcohol, who can sell tobacco, etc. So these things can be really, really effective at reducing consumption of demerit goods. Now, what we can also do, we can use regulations, though, to limit the production of negative externalities. So we could, for example, have on negative externalities restrictions again. So when you think about an airport that creates lots of bad impacts on third parties, we can have limits to how much pollution they're allowed to create, how much noise they're allowed to pay, limitations on when they can produce their products, limitations on all sorts of different things which would have bad impacts on local people. Okay, so restrictions can be used to reduce those impacts of negative externalities. Now, we can also use regulation to raise consumption of merit goods. Now, remember, in a free market economy, merit goods, which often create lots of wonderful positive externalities, are often under-consumed. So what we could do, we could use regulation, so rules in markets, to raise consumption of these products. So when you think about education, it's enforced. So legally, children below the age of 18 have to be in some form of education. So if we think it's so good for people, we can enforce consumption of these different products. So guys, demerit goods, we can use regulation, so rules in markets to limit the consumption of these products. Merit goods, we can use rules to enforce consumption or raise consumption of what we deem to be good products in markets. Now, if we were thinking about evaluating then regulation, let's think about what's good and what is bad about regulation in markets. Now, what we would say is, first of all, a good thing, it should limit the production and consumption of negative externalities and demerit goods. So we went through all those different examples of how regulation can ban bad products from the economy. It can limit the production, limit the sale of them. We can also limit how these products are advertised on TV to reduce consumption of bad products. Now, we can also use regulation, though, to encourage more production and consumption of positive externalities. So we looked at that example, we can enforce consumption of education for children, which will create more wonderful external benefits for society. Now, if we were thinking about the drawbacks of regulation, then the biggest drawback of regulation is the cost of enforcement. Because these rules are in effect legal requirements that businesses and consumers have got to follow, then ultimately there's a responsibility of the government to fund the police appropriately to enforce these different laws. Well, that's a very, very difficult thing to try to do. Now, on top of that as well, because these laws are very, very difficult to enforce, it often means that lots and lots of additional money has to be handed out to the police to enforce these different laws. So what that will do, it will carry an opportunity cost for the government. So spending money on law enforcement would create extra tax burdens for society, and that could carry opportunity cost problems. Less money could be made available for other parts of the economy, healthcare, education, etc. So guys, the big problem of regulation is the difficulty and the costs of enforcing these different laws. Okay, right, now the next one, tradable pollution permits then. Now we can show this with a diagram. Now when we look at tradable pollution permits, we're thinking here about negative externalities. What we know is in a free market economy, the pollution created from industries, so factories, etc., is an external cost. So firms will not pay for these external costs. This therefore means that these external costs are not internalised. So the bad impacts that these industries create will be bad for third parties. The firms in the industry are not paying for their pollution. So what we're going to do through tradable pollution permits is to create a market for pollution. So what the government have got to try to work out is what they think is an optimal level of pollution. So what do they deem to be an acceptable level of pollution? They will then supply a fixed amount of permits in that marketplace. So what we're doing, we're placing a limit on how much pollution can actually be produced by this industry. So straight away, we're moving pollution towards an optimal level. Now, the idea will now be if businesses want to pollute the air, then they've got to demand permits from the government. So the demand for permits is like a normal demand curve. So the idea will be the cheaper the permits are, the more businesses will want to buy these permits, the more expensive they are, the less that they will want to buy. Now look what this therefore does, it will create a price to permits. In this diagram here, equal to P1. So we're going to allow the market to determine what the price of these permits should be. Now the idea will now be then that firms are now paying for pollution. So what we're now doing, we are internalising the external cost of pollution. The firm is now having to pay money to cover some of the different pollution that they're creating. Now think about what this should now do. It's going to raise the costs of creating pollution, and what this should do is incentivise businesses to find ways of reducing their pollution levels. So it might incentivise more firms to now invest into greener, cleaner technology so they can reduce their pollution levels. Now, on top of that as well, we can also argue that what these permits will do, they will raise government revenue. So these permits can therefore raise cash for the government, and this money can then be used to compensate the people that are suffering the problems of this pollution. Now, there's one final benefit of these pollution permits as well. They are tradable. So the idea is if you're a firm and you've bought too many permits, then you can sell these to other firms in the industry. So if you can cut back on your pollution levels, then what you can do, you can sell off unused permits that can be passed on to other producers in the market. So you've got an incentive again to want to reduce how much pollution that you create. Now, governments over time can then be really, really clever. As time goes on, they can reduce the supply of permits. And what this will do, it will over time raise the price of pollution. It's a way of, over time reducing our pollution levels as a country and reducing these bad impacts we have on the environment. Now, if we were evaluating the overall tradable pollution permits, the biggest benefit for me is this. It will internalise external costs. In other words, we're making sure the market is paying for the problems that it creates. So what we are doing here, we are correcting market failure. It's going to reduce pollution levels, but it's also going to ensure that money is raised to compensate the people that have struggled because of the pollution that is created. It's also going to provide for businesses an incentive to reduce pollution. If they now know they've got to buy permits to pollute, there's a cost. They've now got an incentive to invest into cleaner, greener, better technology, which is good for the environment and good for third parties. Now, another problem, though, is that you tend to find that the larger firms are able to afford to buy more permits. Bigger firms can gobble up all the permits, which means that smaller firms cannot access the permits they need to produce goods and services. And that can mean that smaller businesses struggle to compete in these markets. Now, when we move on to theme 3, we're going to be looking at why that's a problem if it affects competition in marketplaces, if it stops small businesses from setting up and competing. Another problem is relocation. If the UK, for example, was to impose pollution permits, we're raising the cost of production in the UK economy. It's possible that what our big businesses might do is think, you know what, it's now too expensive to produce in the UK. So these firms might now have to relocate their production to economies across the world that are not enforcing pollution permits. Now, if that happens, you've not fixed the problem, you've relocated the problem somewhere else. But it would create a loss of economic welfare in our economy, because what it would mean is that businesses close down, and then we've got the unemployment that would go with it. And that makes it more difficult for those people to meet their wants and needs. You've also got another problem as well, and it's something that we've mentioned before: inability to shadow price. How on earth can the government calculate what is an acceptable level of pollution? It really is a value judgment. So how can they appropriately work out how much pollution we should allow these businesses to produce? It's very difficult to say. If that's the case, it could still mean there's too much pollution, or you might even argue we're not allowing firms to pollute enough. So it's very difficult for governments to set what the optimal level of pollution should be in a marketplace. Right, anyway, now the next one that we're going to be looking at is going to be state provision. Now, we've got another name for state provision. We can call it state production, but we can also call these things nationalised industries. Now, all this means is that the government are providing goods and services directly to consumers rather than businesses. Do you remember, when firms provide things in a free market economy, it's driven by profit. If governments produce goods and services, it's not generally done for profit, it's done to raise economic welfare. So it's not profit orientated, it's about economic welfare. Now, what we know is in a free market economy, public goods would not be produced. Well, if the free market economy will not produce public goods, then the argument would be that the government are required to produce public goods. So things like flood defences will be funded by the government because the free market economy will not do it. Well, this therefore means that public goods will exist in the economy. So all the benefits they create will now exist in our economy. Governments have also got a habit of providing things which create positive externalities. So when you think about something like healthcare or education, they are provided as free at point of use services. Now, all that means is if you walk into a hospital, you don't pay directly when you walk in to benefit from them services. You don't pay directly for your A-levels, but they are funded through your parents' taxes. So the idea is that if we can provide positive externalities as free at the point of use services, then it will raise consumption of these good products. Now, it's also worth noting, though, as well, that you often quite find that other positive externality goods are often heavily subsidised by the government. So they might be running certain services at a loss. So the government are picking up the shortfall. So, for example, if you were to walk into your local sports centre, I don't know, Kirklees Active Leisure, you will pay for the services, but CAL, which is owned by the state, will not be run for profit. It will be topped up by subsidies from the government to make sure that people can access it at a good price. Now, you also find that key infrastructure is also state produced. So we're thinking about road networks, other transport links, even to a certain extent power supplies. And the big argument is that some of these big industries are so important for the running of the economy that they should be owned by the government and not by private businesses in the country. But the main takeaway point is, everyone, that state provision or nationalised industries are designed to raise consumption of public goods and positive externalities. The government will provide things at a price that is not generating a lot of profit, a lot of time, or any profit at all, but will provide things that will satisfy wants and needs rather than satisfy shareholders and raise profits. Now, if we were thinking about an evaluation then of state provision, the good thing is it would ensure better provision of positive externalities and merit goods. Remember, these things are often provided free at the point of use or at subsidised prices, and that will hopefully ensure that more people can consume these products and therefore create extra benefits for society. Now, the big drawback of this, though, is what we talk about the lack of the profit motive. What we know is that state-owned industries are run to benefit society. They're not run for profit. Now, that often means that these industries are really, really inefficient. They're not very good at keeping their costs under control. Now, because they're really, really inefficient, quite often they create a big tax burden for the government. In other words, they have to be supported with extra government finance to keep these industries running. And that again carries an opportunity cost. It reduces how much money could be available for other parts of the economy. Right, guys, now the last one is about information provision of information, I beg your pardon. Now, think about information failure. It's where consumers and producers lack information in markets. And if you lack information, it will often lead to irrational decision making. And that is what often leads to people under-consuming merit goods and over-consuming demerit goods. So what we've got to do, we've got to give people more information. And the more information that we have available, the more rational we can be. And that will hopefully raise consumption of merit goods and reduce consumption of things like demerit goods. Now, think about some of the examples of this. What we will provide, for example, on packaging of demerit goods is information about the problems. So when you think about it, on food packaging, there'll be health risks displayed. So on tobacco, it will display the problems of consuming that product. When you buy food products, it will display calories, sugars, and fat content. The more information people have got, the more opportunities they've got to make rational decisions. But governments can also promote merit goods through the media. So, for example, when it comes to education, they can promote opportunities available to people, how to go to university, the benefits of apprenticeship programs. And again, the more information people have got, the more rational they can be. We also provide information in other areas. So, for example, if you walk into a restaurant or a cafe, they will display their food hygiene rating in the window. So 0 would be they're terrible, 4 and 5 would mean they're really, really good. So that is giving people information about whether it's somewhere they want to be or not. So guys, the overall idea is give people more information so they can make more rational decisions in markets. Now, overall, if I'm thinking then about an evaluation of this, the big benefit of this, it will encourage rational decision making. The more information people have got, the more accurate they can base their consumption and production on. Okay, so what this will do, it will create information failures. So it will help tackle things like asymmetric information, imperfect information, and it will tackle the over-consumption of demerit goods and the under-consumption of merit goods. Now, there is a problem, though. It creates costs. If we're going to be advertising information throughout the media, that's going to create extra costs for the government. Well, that's extra tax revenue that's got to be spent on giving people the appropriate information. Well, again, that will carry an opportunity cost problem. You've also got a problem with what we call people failure. Now, the idea here is, do people actually have sufficient information in the market to make a decision? Well, if they don't, the logic would be, let's give them more information. But the problem is, will people actually understand or take on board that information provided? So people failure is this idea that people might be given information from the government to make a rational decision, but if people don't understand that information still, so weakness at computation, they will still be irrational, or people might choose to ignore that information that's provided to them. And if that's the case, then we're still going to have irrational decision making going on. We've also got to consider this. Does the government have the information? Can we really rely on governments to give us appropriate information? If information's imperfect, well, why do we assume the government know the information? It's possible that they don't. It's also possible the government might give us the wrong information. And if that's the case, it might encourage even more irrational decision making in markets. And if that's the case, it's a poor set of information the government provided us with. Right, guys, now think about what we've just done then. We've been through these final 4 types of government intervention: regulation, tradable pollution permits, state provision, and information provision. So guys, remember, these interventions are designed to correct these market failures. In your exam, you will be required to explain how these interventions can fix these market failures, but also some of the problems that we've got with using these interventions to fix these different market failures. Now, if you can talk about the disadvantages of these policies, what you're doing, you're evaluating, and that's a really, really important skill to help you achieve those higher marks in the exams. Anyway, everyone, we'll stop there. So thank you very much for watching.